When people talk about the winter of 1943 in New York City, they usually talk about ration lines, troop transports crowding the harbour, blackout drills, and the constant anxiety of a world at war. They talk about shipyards running day and night, about Liberty ships sliding into the Atlantic like steel whales, about a city stretched thin but unbroken. What they don't talk about is what was found beneath the waterline when the harbour was dredged to make room for war. The work began quietly, without ceremony. The Army Corps of Engineers had issued routine orders to deepen certain channels along the East River and parts of the Upper Bay. The reasoning was simple and unremarkable. Larger ships were coming, heavier cargo, more traffic. The harbour needed to adapt. Crews arrived with dredges and barges, working odd hours to avoid disrupting military schedules. This wasn't a public project. There were no reporters, no photographs meant for newspapers, just men, machinery, and the riverbed. At first, the dredging progressed exactly as expected. Mud, silt, centuries of discarded refuse, timber fragments from old piers, rusted anchors, the occasional sunken hull from a long-forgotten accident. Everything fit the narrative of a harbour that had been used, abused, and layered over by history. But then the dredge struck something that didn't move. The operator assumed it was bedrock. That was common enough in certain stretches. The machine strained, vibrated, then stopped. Divers were sent down to assess the obstruction. When they surfaced, their reports didn't match expectations. They didn't describe jagged stone or uneven natural formations. They described a flat surface, smooth, too smooth. The supervisors dismissed it as an anomaly. Perhaps an old foundation from a demolished pier, they said. Perhaps a submerged platform poured during an earlier expansion and forgotten. Orders were given to clear around it. The dredge adjusted its angle. More material was removed, and that's when the shape began to reveal itself. What lay beneath the silt was not a single slab, but a sequence of surfaces connected at precise angles. Edges aligned too perfectly to be accidental. Corners that met at right angles where no right angles should exist beneath a tidal river. As more sediment was cleared away, the divers reported vertical walls descending farther than expected, disappearing into darkness below their lamps. This wasn't recorded in the public logs. In the official paperwork, the obstruction was labelled as subsurface structural debris. The term was vague enough to satisfy administrative requirements without prompting further inquiry. But internally, the language was different. Engineers began using words like chamber, corridor, and continuation. The deeper they cleared, the less the structure resembled anything built during New York's known history. It wasn't timber. It wasn't poured concrete. It wasn't rubble. It was stone. Massive blocks fitted together with a precision that defied the crude underwater construction techniques available before modern times. There was no visible mortar. The joints were so tight that even marine growth struggled to take hold between them. The strangest part wasn't the craftsmanship. It was the scale. The harbour floor is not supposed to support architecture of that magnitude. The riverbed shifts. Tides exert constant pressure. Ice flows grind against anything stationary. Yet these structures had endured. They hadn't collapsed. They hadn't fractured. They sat beneath the harbour as though the river had been poured over them after the fact. As dredging continued, more segments were uncovered. Passages extending horizontally. Vertical shafts descending beyond the limits of safe diving depth. Some sections appeared deliberately sealed, their entrances blocked by stone slabs fitted so seamlessly they appeared grown rather than placed. Others were open, though filled with centuries of silt, compacted so densely it took hours to remove inches at a time. Divers began refusing assignments. Not because of danger, at least not physical danger. They complained of disorientation, of currents that behaved strangely near the openings, of sound carrying in ways it shouldn't underwater, vibrations that travelled through the stone and into the body. One diver reported tapping his knife against a wall and feeling the impact echo back through his chest rather than his ears. The complaints were noted, then quietly ignored. War didn't allow room for hesitation. The harbour needed to be ready. Whatever this was, it had to be dealt with. The first chamber was breached accidentally. A dredge arm dislodged a blocking stone, and water rushed into a void that had not known the river for a very long time. The sudden pressure difference created a vortex strong enough to pull debris downward. When it stabilised, divers were sent to inspect the damage. What they found was not collapse, it was space. A vast interior, its ceiling arched and smooth, its walls curving with mathematical consistency. The floor sloped gently toward a central depression where water now pooled, swirling slowly as if guided by channels beneath the surface. The chamber was larger than most buildings standing above it. And it was not alone. Corridors extended from the chamber at regular intervals, radiating outward like spokes. Each corridor maintained the same dimensions. Same height, same width, same curvature. The design was uniform in a way that suggested standardization, repetition, intent. There were markings on the walls, not symbols in any recognizable language, not carvings in the traditional sense, more like shallow grooves arranged in patterns that repeated across surfaces, always in the same proportions, always aligned to the same axes. They weren't decorative, they looked functional, like components of a system. Lighting equipment was brought down. Photographs were taken, though not by press photographers. These images were for engineering review, for internal assessment. In them, the men look small, insignificant. Their equipment looks temporary, almost intrusive, as if they are trespassing somewhere they were never meant to be. Questions began circulating quietly among the supervisors. None of them were recorded in official correspondence. They were spoken after hours, in closed rooms, in low voices. How old was this? Who built it? Why was it here? And most unsettling of all, why did it align so perfectly with the modern city above? When engineers overlaid harbour maps with city plans, they noticed something that unsettled even the most rational among them. Certain underground corridors followed the same trajectories as major avenues. Some shafts rose directly beneath intersections, not slightly off, directly, as though the surface city had inherited its geometry from something older, something unseen. The official explanation shifted again. Now the structures were described as early industrial infrastructure, possibly experimental tunnels or abandoned utility works. The timeline was left deliberately vague. The emphasis moved toward practicality. Whatever this was, it was in the way, and the war could not wait. Orders came down to stabilize the site. Portions of the structure were deemed unsafe, despite showing no signs of instability. Access points were sealed. Corridors were backfilled with dredged material. Certain areas were reinforced not to preserve them, but to ensure they could no longer be entered. Some engineers objected, not loudly, not formally, but enough to be noticed. Within weeks they were reassigned. Other projects, other cities, their names disappeared from the harbour logs. The dredging resumed elsewhere, but the discoveries didn't stop. In a different section of the harbour, closer to Brooklyn, another obstruction was encountered. This one was deeper, harder to reach. When divers descended, they found not stone, but metal, not scrap, not wreckage. A structure composed of interlocking components, fused together in ways that defied conventional metallurgy. The surfaces were corroded, but the corrosion patterns were wrong, too uniform, too controlled. The metal was embedded in stone that surrounded it seamlessly, as though the two materials had been shaped together. There were no seams, no signs of later insertion. The stone curved around the metal forms, hugging them with precision. Samples were taken. Quietly, they were sent to laboratories under nondescript labels. The results were inconclusive. The composition didn't match known alloys. The heat exposure required to produce the fusion patterns exceeded anything documented for the era the surrounding stone was presumed to belong to. Those reports never made it into the central archive. Copies existed for a time, then they didn't. As winter progressed, the tone of the internal communications changed. Early reports had been detailed, almost enthusiastic. Engineers love puzzles, after all. But by early 1944, the language became clipped, minimal. Observations were replaced with conclusions. Features became irrelevant. Anomalies became natural variations. Photography was restricted, then prohibited. The final phase of the project was described as completion. In reality, it was closure. Entire sections of the harbour floor were layered with sediment deliberately, far more than structural necessity demanded. Known access points were buried beneath meters of material. Charts were updated to show uniform depths, erasing the contours that had once hinted at what lay beneath. When the war ended, the harbour celebrated. Ships returned. Commerce resumed. The city moved forward. The dredging project faded into bureaucratic obscurity. its records boxed, labelled and stored. But not all of them. Decades later, archivists would stumble across fragments. A photograph misfiled under an unrelated project. A memo referencing non-conforming subsurface geometry. A diver's personal letter describing spaces too exact to be accidental. These fragments raised questions that no one seemed eager to answer. When historians asked about the dredging operations, they were told nothing unusual had occurred. Standard work, standard challenges. The harbour was like any other harbour. Mud, debris, forgotten wrecks. End of story. Yet the city above continued to behave strangely. Certain subway lines experienced unexplained structural anomalies during construction, encountering voids where none should exist. Builders would hit unexpectedly hard stone at depths, inconsistent with bedrock maps. Occasionally, tunneling equipment would register vibrations from no apparent source, rhythmic and regular, as if something far below was responding. These incidents were treated individually, never connected, each one explained away with localized geology or outdated surveys. But when viewed together, a pattern emerges. The structures beneath the harbour were not isolated. They were part of something larger, something integrated, something that predated the city yet shaped it. The most unsettling possibility is not that an unknown civilization once built beneath what is now New York. It is that every generation afterward built on top of it without realizing, or perhaps without acknowledging, what they were inheriting. Foundations placed where foundations had always been placed. Streets aligned along invisible corridors. Infrastructure following paths laid down long before asphalt and steel. And when the harbour was opened by necessity, when the riverbed was disturbed deeply enough to expose what lay below, the response was not curiosity, it was concealment. Because some discoveries don't just challenge historical timelines, they challenge the idea that progress is linear, that civilization advances in a straight line from primitive to modern, that what exists now is the pinnacle of what has ever been. If something beneath the harbour was more sophisticated, more precise, more durable than what stands above it, then the story we tell ourselves about human development becomes fragile. And fragility is dangerous during a time of war, or any time power depends on certainty. So the chambers were sealed, the corridors were buried, the photographs were scattered, the reports were softened until they said nothing at all. But the structures didn't vanish. They remain where they always were, beneath the harbour, beneath the city, beneath the assumptions layered over them like sediment. Every tide moves over them. Every ship passes above them. Every foundation presses down on their ceilings. And every so often, when construction goes too deep, when drills reach farther than intended, when surveys don't quite match reality, the city gets a brief reminder. A resistance where there should be none, a void where solid ground is expected, a geometry that doesn't belong. Those moments are quickly managed, explained, covered. The work continues. Because the most unsettling thing is not that something ancient lies beneath the harbour. It's that we may still be living inside its shadow, following its design, unaware of how much of our world rests on foundations we didn't build and histories we were never meant to uncover.